is a kind of moment that comes only once in a man's life. A moment that lasts no more than a few seconds, but somehow contains everything he has ever believed about himself. Whether he is the person he always told himself he was, or just another man who looked away when it mattered most. Reed Calloway had that moment on a Thursday afternoon in the canyon country of New Mexico, when he came around a bend in the trail and saw something that stopped the air in his lungs cold. 4 armed men. 1 child. And the kind of silence that means something terrible is about to happen. Reed was not a man who went looking for trouble. He had done enough of that in his younger years, scouting for the army through territories that left marks on him he never quite talked about. By the time he had his own land, his own cattle, and his own 4 walls to sleep inside, he had made a quiet agreement with himself. Keep your head down, tend your herd, let the world run its course. He was 43 years old. His wife had been gone for 6 years, and the only thing he still cared about defending was a small piece of rocky ground near the Rio Puerco that the bank had tried to take from him twice and failed. He was a simple man, living a deliberate life. And then the trail bent, and the world asked him a question he could not pretend not to hear. The boy could not have been more than 12. He was pressed back against the red canyon wall, one arm raised slightly in front of him, in that instinctive human gesture that means, stay back. His clothing was Apache. His feet were bare against the stone. His dark eyes were moving fast between the 4 men who had fanned out in a loose half-circle around him, not because he was afraid, Reed could see that clearly, but because he was counting, calculating, looking for the gap. He had the composure of someone raised to face danger without flinching, but he was still a child, and the men surrounding him were not. The one doing the talking was a wide-shouldered man named Greer. Reed did not know his name yet, but he would learn it before the day was over. Greer worked for a land acquisition company out of Santa Fe, an outfit that dressed up its business in legal language, but operated like something considerably less polished when no lawyers were watching. The railroad wanted a survey corridor through that canyon country, and certain Apache hunting grounds sat directly in the way of where certain powerful men wanted to put tracks. The method for clearing those grounds was not always paperwork. Sometimes it was intimidation, sometimes it was worse, and sometimes it started with whatever member of a tribe happened to be walking alone. Reed pulled his horse to a stop at the top of the trail. From where he sat, he could see everything clearly. He could also turn around. The men had not seen him yet. The boy had not seen him yet. There was still a version of this afternoon where Reed Calloway rode back the way he came, unseen, uninvolved, and went home to tend his cattle and eat whatever was left in his pantry and sleep the sleep of a man who had not done anything wrong that day, because technically, he had not. That version existed. It was real. He could feel it pulling at him the way a current pulls at a man standing knee-deep in a river. He put his heels to his horse and rode down into the canyon. He came in at a walk, not a charge, which was deliberate. A man riding in hard and fast reads as panic. A man riding in at a steady walk reads as something else entirely. It reads as a man who is not afraid. Greer turned first, hand dropping to his hip, and Reed kept his own hands visible, reins in one, the other open and resting on his thigh. "Afternoon," Reed said. His voice came out level and unhurried, which surprised even him. Greer squinted up at him. "This doesn't concern you, friend." "Maybe not," Reed said. He looked past Greer at the boy, then back. "But I'm going to need you to step back from that child." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. One of the other men, younger, with a restless energy and a rifle already half raised, let out a short laugh. Greer did not laugh. He studied Reed the way a man studies something he is trying to place, trying to figure out whether this was a real problem or a manageable one. "He's Apache," Greer said finally, as though that was a complete explanation. "I can see that," Reed said. "Step back." What happened next was not a gunfight. There were no bodies in the dust. No dramatic last-second draw and the smell of powder smoke and someone falling from their saddle. What happened was considerably less cinematic and in some ways considerably more frightening. Greer looked at Reed for a long time. He looked at the rifle across Reed's saddle. He looked at the boy, who had not moved, still pressed against the canyon wall with that steady, measuring gaze. And then Greer looked at something behind Reed, which made Reed go very still. Because when a man looks behind you that carefully, you either turn and look yourself and lose the advantage, or you trust that whatever he sees back there is not going to kill you before he does. Reed did not turn. He held Greer's eyes. Greer stepped back. 1 step, then 2. The other men followed, with the uncertain shuffling of people who have not quite decided what they are doing. "You're making a mistake," Greer said quietly. Not loud, not theatrical. Just a simple statement, the way a man tells you the weather is going to change. "I've made them before," Reed said. Greer looked at him one more time, and then the 4 of them walked back to their horses and rode south along the canyon floor without another word. Reed watched them until they rounded the bend and disappeared, and then he let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in his chest for the last several minutes. He looked at the boy. The boy looked back at him with those dark, assessing eyes and said nothing at all. "You hurt?" Reed asked. The boy shook his head slowly. "You know where your people are?" A pause, then a careful nod in the direction of the northern ridgeline. Reed stepped down from his horse. His knees felt older than usual. He walked over to his saddlebag, pulled out a cloth-wrapped piece of dried venison and a half-full canteen, and held them both out without making a production of it. The boy watched his hands the whole time, the way a young animal watches something new, deciding whether to bolt or stay. Then he reached out and took the canteen, drank from it without taking his eyes off Reed, and handed it back. "Go on then," Reed said, stepping aside. "Get back to your people before those men decide to come back with more." The boy stood there for another moment. Then he reached into the small leather pouch at his side and held something out. It was a carved piece of turquoise, small, shaped roughly like a running deer. Reed looked at it for a moment, then took it. When he looked up, the boy was already moving up the canyon wall with the quick, sure-footed ease of someone who had grown up learning every stone of that country by heart. Reed stood in the canyon with the carved turquoise in his palm and the fading sound of the boy's footsteps above him, and tried to figure out what had just happened to his afternoon. He did not find out what it truly meant for another 3 weeks. If you're settling into this story, now is a good time to leave a like on this video. It helps more than you might think, and it lets us keep bringing you stories like this one. Now, back to Reed Calloway and what was coming for him. Reed's land sat in a shallow valley where the grass came in sparse and yellow most of the year, where the creek that crossed his eastern fence ran strong in spring and went to nothing by August. He had 500 head of cattle, give or take, and a hand named Virgil who was 60 years old, slow-moving, and the most reliable person Reed had ever known. Virgil had been there when Reed's wife was alive, and he had stayed after, and they had an arrangement that involved very little conversation and considerable mutual respect. The trouble with the land acquisition company did not start because of what happened in the canyon. Reed knew enough about how these things worked to understand that he had been on their list for some time before that afternoon. His land sat squarely between 2 parcels they had already absorbed, and the survey lines that the railroad needed to file with the territorial government ran straight through his property. He had received 2 letters. He had not responded to either. The third communication, when it came, was not a letter. It arrived on a Monday in the form of 6 men on horseback who rode up to his gate and told him he had 30 days to vacate. Their paperwork looked official in the way that things look official when someone has spent money to make them look that way. Reed read it twice, handed it back, and told them he would be consulting with the only lawyer in Alameda who he trusted, a man named Fletcher, who had represented him in the bank disputes years earlier. What Greer's men did next, Reed did not see coming, which was his first real mistake. He had underestimated the timetable. While he rode to Alameda to see Fletcher, someone hit his property. They did not burn it. They were smarter than that. They moved his herd, all 500 head, 3 miles east into a neighboring canyon under cover of dark, and rebranded them with a crude but adequate mark before driving them south. By the time Reed returned the next afternoon, Virgil was standing in the middle of an empty pasture with his hat in his hands and the particular look of a man who cannot quite believe what his own eyes are telling him. The cattle were gone. His livelihood, his collateral on the land note, everything he had to his name beyond the fence posts and the cabin walls, gone. And when the county sheriff rode out, the men Greer worked for had a bill of sale, dated 2 days prior, for 500 head matching the description, purchased from a seller who did not exist, but whose signature was convincing enough that the sheriff, a man who owed his position to the same interests, called it a matter for the courts, and rode away. Reed sat on his porch that night and looked at the dark pasture, and understood, clearly and completely, what was happening. This was how it was done. Not with violence in the open, not with anything so direct as putting a gun to a man's head and demanding he sign. This was the clean version, the version with paperwork, the version where a man simply found himself unable to meet his land note, unable to prove his cattle were his cattle, unable to fight a legal machine that had been specifically constructed to grind him down until he gave up or went broke or both. Fletcher told him honestly, when Reed rode back the following morning, that the legal path would take 18 months and cost more than Reed had, that even if they won, the judgment could be appealed, that the same thing had happened to 4 other landowners in the territory in the past 2 years, and that none of them had kept their land. Reed rode home through the late afternoon heat with the particular hollowness of a man who has fought hard his whole life and is beginning to wonder if it was for anything. The sky over the canyon country was a deep, relentless blue, the kind of blue that does not care about any particular man's problems. He had saved a boy from 4 hired men in a canyon, and it had cost him everything. He came up over the last rise before his property, and he stopped his horse. There were people at his fence line, a great many people. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. What's about to happen is the part of this story that nobody who hears it forgets. He counted them as he came down the slope, and he stopped counting at 40. They were Apache, men, women, some elders on horseback, some on foot. They had positioned themselves in a line that ran the full length of his visible fence, not threatening, not aggressive, simply present, in the way that mountains are present, in the way that things that cannot be moved are present. Several of them had horses loaded with packs. At the center of the line, mounted on a dark horse that stood perfectly still, was a man whose bearing alone would have told you everything you needed to know about him, even if he had been dressed in rags. He was somewhere past 60, with long silver-streaked hair and a face that had been carved by years of sun and command, and the kind of responsibility that does not let a man rest easy. Standing beside that horse on the ground was the boy from the canyon. Reed pulled his horse to a walk and came in slowly, the same way he had come into that canyon 3 weeks before. He stopped 20 feet from the elder and waited. The boy said something in Apache, looking up at the man Reed now understood was his father. The elder looked at Reed for a long time. His eyes were dark and very direct. Not hostile, not warm, simply honest, in the way that certain people are honest, where every piece of what they mean is right there on the surface, and there is no performance underneath it. He spoke. His voice was deep and unhurried. One of the men behind him, younger, maybe 30, translated into careful English. "My father says you stood between his son and men with guns. He says you did not know who the boy was. He says that matters." Reed nodded slowly. "It mattered to me." The elder spoke again. "He says his son told him what you did and how you did it. That you came in without drawing your weapon. That you held still when they looked behind you. That you gave the boy food and water and stepped aside. He says a man who fights with his presence instead of his gun is worth more than a man who shoots first." Reed did not know what to say to that. He said nothing. The elder looked past him toward the empty pasture. He seemed to already know what had happened. He spoke at length, and the translator worked through it in segments. "He says he knows the men who came for your land. He says they have taken from others in this territory before and will take again. He says his people have watched this valley for longer than any deed or survey line has existed, and that the cattle that were stolen from you are in a canyon 2 days south, held in a draw behind a red rock formation that a man on horseback could reach by nightfall tomorrow if he knew the way." A pause. "He says his son will show you the way." Reed felt something move through him that he could not have named precisely. Something between relief and something older and less familiar, the feeling of being seen clearly by someone who owed you nothing and chose to see you anyway. "That's not all," the translator said, and his tone shifted slightly, carrying the weight of what came next. The elder spoke again, and this time the words were slower, more deliberate, and the translator listened all the way through before he began. "He says the men who took your cattle are the same men who have been pushing his people from hunting grounds in this canyon country for 2 seasons. He says there is a paper that one of those men carries, a document that the railroad company needs for its survey claim, and that without that document the claim cannot be filed. He says his people found that document 3 days ago in a saddlebag that was left unattended. He says he is prepared to give you that document." Reed went very still. "He says a man who will not look away from a child in danger is a man whose land is worth fighting for. He says his people do not make this kind of agreement lightly, but they make it with open eyes. He says that if you use that document to fight your claim in court, his people will stand as witnesses to what was taken from you and how. He says his name will be on whatever paper the judge requires." The canyon country around them was very quiet. A hawk turned overhead in the long blue distance. Virgil had come out of the cabin and was standing at the corner of the porch, hat in hand, watching. Reed looked at the elder. "Why?" he asked. Not arguing, not disbelieving, just asking, because he genuinely wanted to understand. The elder listened to the translation and then answered, and this time his voice was quieter, and the translator's voice was quieter too when he converted it. "He says that a man who protects what cannot protect itself is a man whose presence makes this land better. He says his people have seen enough of the other kind. He says the ones who take without asking, the ones who push children against canyon walls to frighten their fathers, those men do not understand what this land is or what it costs to live on it honestly. He says you do. He says you understood it in a canyon on a Thursday afternoon when no one was watching, and you thought it would cost you nothing." A pause. "He says it cost you everything, and that is why he is here." What followed over the next week was the kind of thing that does not fit neatly into the version of the West that gets told in dime novels. It was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was slow and practical and required a great deal of patience and paperwork, and one very surprised lawyer named Fletcher, who had never in his professional career received testimony from an Apache war chief but found himself unable to argue with the quality of the evidence placed in front of him. The document the elder's people had recovered was an internal survey authorization signed by a senior railroad official that directly contradicted the public filing the land acquisition company had submitted to the territorial government. It showed that the company had knowingly falsified boundary coordinates to encompass private holdings that the railroad had no legal right to claim. It also showed that the bill of sale used to justify taking Reed's cattle had been prepared 6 days before the cattle were allegedly purchased, which put the timeline in a territory that even a cooperative sheriff could not easily navigate around. Fletcher filed the challenge. The railroad company's attorneys came up from Santa Fe. The Apache elder came to Alameda with 4 of his people and sat in a chair in the county courthouse and gave a statement through a translator that the judge, a man named Harker, who had been on the bench for 22 years and had seen most things, later described privately as the most straightforward testimony he had ever received from any witness in any proceeding. There was no embellishment, no performance, just a clear account of what had been observed, what had been taken, and how. The company's attorneys tried 3 different approaches to discredit the testimony and failed at all 3. They tried to argue the document was fabricated. They could not explain the internal notations that matched handwriting samples from their own files. They tried to argue the Apache witnesses had no standing before a territorial court. Harker overruled them on precedent and then looked at them over his glasses in a way that stopped them from trying a 3rd variation of the same argument. They tried to argue the cattle acquisition had been a legitimate commercial transaction. Fletcher produced the non-existent seller's address, which turned out to be a lot in Albuquerque that contained a dry goods warehouse and had never housed any person matching the signatory's name. The judgment came down on a Friday morning and was unambiguous. Reed's land note was reinstated. His cattle were returned. Greer and 2 of his associates faced criminal charges that, while slow-moving in the way that criminal charges against well-funded defendants tend to be, were real enough to put a considerable chill on the acquisition company's territorial operations for the foreseeable future. Reed rode home that Friday afternoon with Virgil beside him, and the canyon country opening up ahead of them in the long, late light. He did not say much. Virgil, who never required conversation, did not press him. When they came over the last rise, there was something on the post of the front gate. Reed stopped his horse and looked at it for a moment before he understood what it was. It was a length of cord with a bead pattern worked into it, blue and white and red, hung there sometime in the hours while they had been in town. A marker, an acknowledgement, the kind of thing you leave when you want someone to know that they are not forgotten and not alone. Reed stepped down from his horse and took it in his hands. The beadwork was intricate and deliberate, the kind of thing that takes time and intention. He had no way of knowing who had placed it there, whether it was the boy or someone else, whether it had been done at the elder's instruction or on someone's own initiative. It did not matter. What it meant was the same either way. He hung it on the inside of his door, where he would see it every morning when he woke up and every evening when he came in. Comment below and tell us, what would you have done in Reed's place that afternoon in the canyon? Would you have ridden down, or would you have turned around? We genuinely want to know your answer, because this kind of moment is not as simple as it sounds when you are sitting safely reading about it, and anyone who says it is has probably never been in one. There is a version of this story that people tell as though it is about the repayment, about the document, the testimony, the judgment, the cord on the fence post, about the Apache people doing something remarkable for a man who had helped one of their own. And that version is true, and it matters. But Reed Calloway, in the years that followed, did not tell it that way when he told it at all, which was rarely. He told it as a story about a few seconds in a canyon, about a moment when a man looks at a choice and understands that it will cost him something, possibly everything, and makes it anyway because the cost of not making it is something he cannot calculate and does not want to live inside. He told it as a story about the fact that the boy had the carved turquoise in his pouch that day, that he had been carrying it before any of this happened, before the encounter with Greer's men, before Reed came around the bend. that the boy had brought it on his solitary walk into the canyon country the way a young person sometimes brings something that matters to them when they go out alone to test themselves against the world. And that when he gave it to Reed in the canyon, he was not paying for something. He was giving something of his own, freely, to a stranger who had stood in the right place at the right moment. That is the part Reed thought about most in the quiet years on his land by the Rio Puerco. Not the courthouse, not the judgment, not even the beadwork on the door. Just the fact that in the few seconds when it had mattered, he had been exactly the person he always hoped he was, that he had not turned his horse around. The Apache elder's name was something that did not translate directly into any English word Reed knew, though it had been explained to him once as meaning roughly a man who holds the line. Reed thought that was about as fine a thing as a person could be called. He thought of it sometimes when the spring brought the grass back to his pasture, and the creek ran clear through his eastern fence, and the cattle moved slow and quiet in the golden morning light. Holding the line. Not always in the dramatic way, not always with a rifle and 4 men watching. Sometimes just by showing up to your own life with your eyes open, your hands visible, and your willingness to ride down into whatever canyon the road has put in front of you. He kept the carved turquoise on the shelf beside the window where the morning light hit it first. Small, worn smooth at the edges, the running deer barely visible now from years of handling. Worth nothing to anyone who did not know the story. Worth everything to the man who did. If this story stayed with you, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Share it with someone who you think would understand what it is really about, because the best stories from this territory are not about guns or gold or who drew fastest. They are about what a person chooses to do in the handful of seconds that actually count. Tell us in the comments below which part of this story hit you hardest, and if you have a story of your own like this one where a small choice turned into something much larger, we would genuinely love to hear it. The West was full of those moments. Most of them never got written down. Most of the men and women who lived them never told a soul. But the land remembered. The canyon walls remembered. And sometimes on a quiet afternoon when the light comes in low and golden over the red rock country, it feels like something out there is still paying attention to the choices we make and still deciding, slowly and without hurry, who is worth standing beside.